The storm had no name. It did not need one. It arrived the way all serious things arrive in the mountains, without announcement, without mercy, as a simple and complete fact of the world. By 0340 hours, visibility had dropped to 11 meters. By 0400, it was 6. The snowfield that stretched between Ridge Kappa and the valley floor below had become something indistinguishable from sky, a single, seamless white that erased the horizon and turned the men moving through it into ghosts of themselves. Commander Jake Harlow pressed his back against a boulder that had been cold for 1,000 years and counted his remaining assets. 14 men. Now, 11. Now, as the crack of a distant rifle rolled down through the snow like slow thunder. 10. Kowalski. His radio operator said the name quietly, the way you say the name of someone who is already gone. I know. Harlow did not look up. He was studying the ridgeline. Above the ridgeline he could not see. Only imagine, the way you learn to navigate a room in the dark by remembering where the furniture was. Somewhere up there, at a distance that made conventional response essentially theoretical, was a shooter, maybe two. The pattern of fire suggested one. Patient, measured, no wasted rounds. A professional operating at a range that made him feel, correctly, like a god. The mission had been straightforward: extraction of a diplomatic asset from a valley compound 40 kilometers inside contested territory. 12-hour operation, in and out, light resistance anticipated. The intelligence had been prepared by people who were very good at their work in environments where the variables stayed where you put them. Mountain environments do not keep variables in place. The mountains have their own priorities and they predate every map ever drawn of them. The intelligence had been wrong in the particular way that mountain intelligence is always wrong, confident about things that can be mapped and silent about things that live and breathe and move. The ambush had caught them in transition, caught them in the open space between the compound and the extraction point, caught them in the worst possible configuration. Strung out in single file, committed to a route that now had a rifle trained down its length. Range estimate, Harlow said. His senior sniper, Corporal Davis Fleming, was already prone behind a snowbank, scope to his eye, hand steady in a way that Harlow had spent 20 years trying to understand. Fleming was 26 years old and had a gift. Even he shook his head slowly. Best read I can get is 3,800. Could be more. Ground's folded wrong. Every echo off these ridges is lying to us. He pulled back from the scope. Commander, that's outside. That's outside anything I've got. I know what it is. My max effective is 2,300 in good conditions. In this wind, with this scope, on this ammunition. He paused, doing something in his head. I would be guessing, at that range. I would be sending a guess downrange and hoping the guess was good. He pulled fully back from the scope and sat up. I'm not going to lie to you about that. I know. The wind was the other problem. It came off the summit in pulses, not the steady, manageable pressure that a trained shooter can account for, but something irregular, almost conversational in its unpredictability. It would drop for 4 seconds, then surge, then drop again. The intervals were not fixed. They did not correspond to anything Harlow's experience told him was patterned. The snow swirled in small vortices between the rocks, rose vertically in places, blew horizontal in others, a dozen different local weather events happening simultaneously within a 100-meter radius. In those conditions, at that range, a shot was not a shot. It was a lottery ticket. Another crack. The snow 6 inches from Corporal Trent McGuire's left boot kicked up in a small white explosion, and McGuire flattened himself so fast it looked like the earth had pulled him down. He's adjusting, Fleming said. I see it. He's been adjusting all night. Incrementally. He's patient. Fleming paused. He's good. Harlow did not respond because there was nothing useful to add. The shooter above them was exceptional. The evidence was in the bodies. Kowalski had been taken at roughly 900 meters of separation between the shot and the impact point, accounting for the bullet's travel time, counting for the wind shift that should have moved the round off target, and yet it had not moved. The round had found him with the kind of precision that suggested either extraordinary luck or a level of skill that Harlow had only encountered twice in his career, and both of those times the person doing it had been on his side. He keyed his radio. Fox 6, what is our air support timeline? Static. The storm ate the signal, chewed it, returned nothing. He tried again. Nothing. The temperature was -22°C. His fingers, even inside the double-layered gloves, had moved past cold into something more neutral, a not-quite numbness that meant they were still functioning but drawing down on reserves. In another 2 hours, the reserves would be gone. 9 men, a shooter they could not reach. A storm that was getting worse, not better. No air support, no communication. He thought, with the clarity that only genuine crisis produces, about the civilian convoy that had been sheltering in the compound when they'd arrived. The humanitarian organization medical supplies, emergency equipment that had gotten stuck when the weather closed the passes 3 days ago. They had been there, quiet and in the way and trying not to be noticed when everything went wrong. One of them, he thought, one of them had done something he could not yet identify. Because, when the shooting started, when the team had moved to defensive positions and the professional confusion of a firefight had replaced the professional calm of a planned operation, he had noticed a woman, a slight woman in a gray coat, utterly out of place watching the ridgeline, not cowering, watching. Her name was Elena Voss, and she had been watching snow for a long time. She was 34 years old. She had gray-green eyes that her mother had called weather eyes, not as a compliment, exactly, but as an observation, the way you note that a particular dog has an exceptional nose. Her mother had been a practical woman from a practical part of the country who did not believe in romanticizing either gifts or difficulties. When she said weather eyes, she meant, this child sees things moving that other children do not notice. This child's attention goes to the peripheral. This child will be unusual in ways that are difficult to explain to people who aren't. The eyes were very still. They moved to things that other eyes passed over. The angle of a falling flake, the slight distortion where 2 air currents met, the shadow that wind casts on a flat surface before it arrives. As a child, she had thought everyone saw these things. It had taken years to understand that most people did not, and further years to understand that this was not a problem with most people but simply a different relationship with information. She was, as her travel documents indicated, a seamstress. She ran a small alterations shop in a mid-sized city in a cold part of the country, and she was very good at it. Her clients were loyal. They brought her things that other shops had given up on: wedding dresses with structural damage, inherited coats that had been badly repaired by someone's well-meaning grandmother, suits that had been altered by people who understood cutting but not geometry. Elena understood geometry. She understood how tension moves through fabric, how a single degree of misalignment at a seam can propagate into a distortion 3 feet away. She could look at a garment hanging on a body and know immediately where the error had been introduced, and she could correct it, and her corrections held. She was with the convoy because a colleague had needed a replacement, and she had said yes. It was that simple, or nearly that simple. She helped transport emergency medical supplies to difficult places. She had done it 4 times before. The mountains did not frighten her. Cold did not particularly frighten her. The men with rifles that had appeared on the ridgeline and begun shooting frightened her considerably, and she was not pretending otherwise. She had found a space between 2 large rocks, and she was inside it, and she was very still. But she was watching. She was watching the snow between herself and the ridgeline. She was watching the way it moved in the dead ground between the boulders, dead ground being, as she understood it, terrain sheltered from direct line of sight. She was watching the tiny adjustments the wind made over time, the micro-patterns in the chaos, the thing that was not random but only appeared random from the wrong perspective. She had spent enough time inside weather to know that what looks like randomness at the level of a single snowflake is, at the level of a system, deeply structured. The structure is just operating at a scale and speed that makes it illegible to people who are not specifically attending to it. She was specifically attending to it. She marked the time intervals between the heavy pulses of northwest wind by counting her own heartbeats, which she had trained herself to hold steady and measurable. She logged the changes in the snow's surface behavior across 3 different zones in her field of view. She noted where the crystals rose and where they fell and where they moved in the complex lateral swirls that indicated the meeting of 2 distinct air masses at low altitude. One of the soldiers, young, maybe 22, genuinely frightened in a way he was working very hard to conceal, came scrambling to her position. "Ma'am, you need to move further back. Get against the rock face." "I'm fine here. This isn't negotiable. You're a civilian and we need you." "I understand." She did not move. "What's the range estimate to the shooter?" He stared at her. "Excuse me? I heard someone say 3,800. Is that meters or yards?" "Mime. Meters or yards?" "It matters. Meters. And that's not something you need to worry about. Please move to the wind cycles," she said. "Do you know that? It's not random. It runs approximately 7 seconds on the heavy pulse, then drops to about 3 seconds of relative calm. The heavy pulse comes from the northwest. The calm is caused by the eastern ridge blocking it intermittently. She paused. Does your shooter know that? The young soldier, whose name was Corporal Bradley Wren, stood very still in the snow for a moment. Then he went to find Commander Harlow, the man who said it was not military. He was 58 years old, a former signals intelligence analyst named Gordon Pratt, who had spent 22 years in positions that had never officially existed doing things that had never officially happened, and who was now in whatever undefined capacity that attached itself to certain men who never quite finished their service attached to this convoy in a role that Harlow had not asked about and Pratt had not explained. Pratt had said very little during the operation. He had a habit of watching everything and commenting on nothing, which Harlow had observed and quietly approved of. When Pratt spoke, therefore, people listened, because the reservoir was clearly full. She knows the wind, Pratt said. Harlow turned to look at him. The woman, Elena Voss. Pratt said the name with the care of someone saying something they have been waiting to say. If she says she can work with this wind, you should let her. She's a seamstress. She is currently a seamstress. Yes, Pratt. Commander. Pratt met his eyes, and his eyes were not complicated. They were very direct. There are things I can tell you that I am cleared to tell you and things I cannot. What I can tell you is this. There are people in the world who process physical information differently than the rest of us, differently in ways that are difficult to quantify and therefore tend to make institutions uncomfortable. She has been uncomfortable for institutions before. He paused. If she says wait, then wait. Harlow looked at him for a long moment. Another shot cracked across the valley. The snow where it hit threw up a spray of white 30 meters to his left. He's ranging, Fleming said. He'll have a firing solution on this position inside of 20 minutes. Fleming. Harlow said it slowly. What do we have in terms of bolt-action rifles? The M40 in the team kit. My M110 is semi. For this range, you'd want the bolt. Where is it? Packed. But accessible. Fleming looked at him. You can't be serious. Get it. Don't load it yet. Harlow stood up and walked toward the gap in the rocks where Corporal Wren had told him the civilian woman was positioned. And do not, he said over his shoulder, say a single word to anyone about this until I tell you to. She was exactly where Wren had said, sitting with her back against the inner rock, knees drawn up, both hands in her coat pockets. She was not hunched. She sat very straight, which struck Harlow as a physiologically strange response to being shot at. When he crouched down across from her, she looked at him with the kind of directness that some people find aggressive and which Harlow had learned to identify as simply the absence of unnecessary social performance. Commander, she said, you know who I am. I've been paying attention. Tell me what you see. In the wind. She did not answer immediately. She looked over his shoulder at the valley, at the particular way the snow was moving in the middle distance. He waited. The shooter is on the northeast face, she said. Not the summit. He's below the ridge by maybe 200 meters, which is why the shot trajectories are coming in at that slightly downward angle. The northeast face has a thermal irregularity. It catches reflected heat from the valley floor during daylight hours and creates an updraft that interacts with the primary wind from the northwest. She paused. That interaction creates a node, a point where the two currents partially cancel each other. The node moves with the sun angle, but right now, at this hour, it's approximately 60 meters southeast of this position. She stopped. Go on, Harlow said. The window inside the node is short, 3 to 4 seconds. The primary wind cycle is 7 seconds heavy, then a partial calm. The calm isn't truly calm. There's still approximately 4 to 5 kilometers per hour of residual airflow from the southeast, which is consistent and accountable for. She looked at him steadily. At 4,000 meters, the bullet is in the air for somewhere between 4 and 5 seconds, depending on load. If the shot is fired at the exact right moment in the cycle, using the node, the total wind effect on the round is reduced to something that can be calculated and compensated for on the scope. Harlow said nothing. The compensation is not trivial, she continued. At that range, standard windage tables don't apply because the air density has changed significantly across the bullet's path. It's not one calculation. It's a series of calculations integrated across the flight path, accounting for the node, the residual southeastern airflow, the Coriolis effect at this latitude, and the fact that the air temperature at 3,000 meters above the valley floor is approximately 9 degrees colder than here, which affects the ballistic coefficient. Harlow became aware that he had forgotten to breathe. You've done this before, he said. It was not a question. "I know how to think about it," she said. "That's not the same answer." She looked at him for a moment. "No," she agreed quietly. "It isn't." The M40 was in a hard case inside the team's secondary kit, wrapped in a cloth that someone had used previously to protect electronic equipment. It was not the newest rifle available. It had been built on a Remington 700 Action, modified with a 25-inch stainless barrel and a stock that had been adjusted for a shooter who was now somewhere on the other side of the world. The optic was a Nightforce that had seen better days, not broken, but with the slight stiffness in the elevation turret that accumulates over years of field use. Fleming handed it to her. She took it without ceremony, which immediately set Fleming on edge, because in his experience the people who handled rifles carefully usually had a reason to. "This elevation turret," she said, working it back and forth twice. "It has approximately a quarter MOA of backlash on the upward direction." Fleming stared. "How do you know that?" "The resistance pattern changes." She worked it again, slowly. "Going up, there's a slight catch at the 2/3 point. Coming down, it's smooth. That means the internal cam is worn on one side." She set the rifle across her knees. "I'll need to account for it in my adjustments. It's consistent, which means it's manageable. There's no rangefinder for that distance," Fleming said. His voice had changed tone in a way he was not entirely conscious of. "The standard gear tops out at 2,500 meters under good conditions. I have the range from your earlier estimate and from the acoustic signature of his outgoing rounds." She tilted her head slightly. "A bolt-action rifle at that distance produces a muzzle report that reaches us approximately 11 seconds after the bullet arrives. I've been counting. The average has been consistent at 11.2 seconds across the last 6 shots. That gives you what? Maybe a 50-meter uncertainty band. 40-meter. She was quiet for a moment, which, at this range, translates to approximately 1.5 minutes of angle of uncertainty in the elevation plane. She looked up at Harlow, who had said nothing for several minutes. "I'd rather have certainty, but I don't have it." One of the other soldiers, Staff Sergeant Marcus Dillon, who had spent 11 years as a sniper before transitioning to a direct action role and who had, in that 11 years, never once been shown up by anyone, crouched down and looked at her with an expression that was not quite mockery and not quite respect, and occupied the uncomfortable territory between them. "No spotter," he said. "No firing computer. No confirmed range. No current ballistic table for this specific load. No atmospheric data. Wind that's been doing whatever the hell it wants all night." He paused. "No pressure." She looked at him, and her expression was not defensive. It was, somehow, patient. "The data is here," she said. "It's just not in a computer." Dillon stood up. He walked 3 steps away and stood with his back to her and said nothing, which was, Harlow understood, the closest Marcus Dillon was likely to come to agreeing. There is a thing that happens rarely, and only in certain people, where the boundary between the thinking mind and the physical world becomes very thin. Physicists have terms for aspects of it. Biologists have theories about sensory processing that approaches it from one direction. Athletes sometimes describe something like it in competition. After years of training, reduce the gap between intention and action to nearly nothing. But none of these descriptions quite capture what Harlow watched Elena Voss do in the next 40 minutes, which was to conduct, without instruments, without assistance, and with apparent calm, an assessment of conditions that should have required a team of specialists and several $1,000s of equipment. She watched the snow. Not randomly, she watched specific patterns in specific places, the small variations that told her about the air column above. She watched the crystalline surface of a flat rock 20 meters away, the way the loose snow on its top surface moved. She watched the vapor from her own breath, the lag between exhalation and the moment the condensation was pulled away. She held the rifle and worked the bolt several times, developing feel for its resistance, its lock time, the specific mechanical personality of this particular weapon built by this particular armorer in circumstances she could not know. She was still for long periods. Then she would make a very small adjustment to the scope, a quarter turn here, a half turn there, and go still again. "What is she doing?" Fleming said quietly to Harlow. "I think she's integrating," Harlow said. "Integrating what?" "Everything." Once, she spoke. She said, "The shooter has a heartbeat visible in his rounds. 3 of his last 6 shots show a very slight vertical dispersion consistent with not fully managing his respiratory cycle. He fires on the first exhale, not the second." Fleming thought about that. "That's a bad habit at extreme range." "It is. She turned the elevation turret exactly 1¾ MOA up from where Fleming had zeroed it, compensating for something the rest of them could not see. Then, almost as an afterthought, he's also been shooting for about 4 hours. His precision will degrade by 15 to 20% in the next 30 minutes as fatigue accumulates in his supporting muscles. He'll start compensating consciously, which means he'll start making deliberate errors. Dylan, from his position 3 steps away with his back turned, said nothing, but his shoulders had changed. She lay down behind the rifle. The rock she had chosen as her position was slightly elevated, which allowed a sightline across the valley that cleared the foreground snowbank by approximately 2 meters. She adjusted her body by increments, not randomly, but the way a person adjusts when they are aligning themselves with something invisible to everyone else. "I need to know," she said, when the temperature was last officially logged at the summit weather station. Harlow checked his records. 0200. That's over 2 hours ago. Then the temperature will have dropped another 3 to 4 degrees since then. The air density change over the full flight path will be slightly greater than I calculated. She was quiet for a moment. "I'm adjusting for 4 degrees. If it's only 3, the round will impact approximately half a meter low." She moved the elevation turret an additional eighth of a turn. "Winds shifting," she said. "Heavier from the northwest right now. The node won't appear for another." She watched the surface of the flat rock. Approximately 90 seconds, no one said anything. The shot that killed Corporal Danny Hess came 38 seconds later. It came from the darkness of the ridgeline across the valley, and it was not aimed at Hess, it was aimed at Fleming, who had moved 6 inches to adjust his position, and Hess had been crossing behind him when the bullet arrived. The sound came after. The sound always came after. 90 seconds, Elena said. Her voice was unchanged. "I need quiet." The wind came down heavy from the northwest. 6 seconds. 7. Then the change. Not silence. Exactly. The absence of insistence. The snow stopped its horizontal drive and fell, for a moment, almost vertically. Almost. There was still the residual flow from the southeast, measurable, consistent, already calculated. Elena's right hand was on the stock. Her left was under the forend. Her cheek was against the comb of the stock in a position she had found by feel, and her eye was behind the scope, and the crosshairs were on a point in the darkness of the northeast ridgeline that she had identified 12 minutes ago as the only position that provided the correct sightline geometry for the shooter's observed angles of fire. She was not entirely still. She never was, because nothing biological is entirely still. But she had found the rhythm of her own body, the heartbeat that moves the crosshairs a few thousandths of an inch in each direction, the respiratory cycle that raises and lowers the chest and changes the position of everything attached to it, and she had found the gap between heartbeats, the gap at the bottom of an exhale, the gap in the wind, the node, all 4, simultaneously. Her finger took the slack out of the trigger. Fleming, watching through his own scope at the ridgeline, saw nothing. The darkness was complete. He could not identify the target. He could not confirm the point of aim. He was watching a black mountainside from 4 kilometers away through falling snow, and he was essentially watching nothing and trying to see everything. The M40's trigger broke. The report was not dramatic. It was a crack, single and clean, and the muzzle lifted the prescribed fraction of an inch and returned to position as she worked the bolt without lifting her cheek from the stock, a motion she performed with the automatic smoothness of long practice. The brass cartridge cleared the action and disappeared into the snow behind her without sound. The round was in the air. 1 second, Fleming said, very quietly. "I can't see." 3, 4, 5. At approximately 4 2/3 seconds, something moved on the northeast ridgeline. It was very small from this distance. A change in the shape of a shadow, a slight shift of something against something, the kind of movement that you only see if you are looking for movement in the darkness with your eyes adapted to it and your mind tuned to the frequency. Fleming made a sound that was not a word. Then there was nothing. The wind resumed. The snow came back horizontal. Nobody spoke. Harlow had been counting under his breath. He reached 11 and stopped. No muzzle report arrived from the ridgeline. He counted to 15. To 20, the ridgeline had gone quiet in a way that was entirely different from the quiet before. The silence had contained the possibility of the next shot. This silence did not. This silence had the quality of conclusion. "He's down," Fleming said. He said it slowly, as if testing the words for structural integrity. "I think he's down." Elena worked the bolt again, chambered around, and held the position. watching, not the ridgeline, watching the snow, watching the wind, watching for the secondary shooter she had calculated as a 15% probability. A minute passed. Another. No shot. She lifted her cheek from the stock and rolled away from the firing position and sat with her back against the rock and said nothing. Her breathing was completely even. Her hands were very steady. Harlow looked at her. She looked back at him. One, she said quietly. There was only one. Pratt came and sat beside her while the others reorganized. He sat the way old acquaintances sit, not close, not far, at a comfortable parallel distance, looking at the same general direction. That was well done, he said. Someone died while I was calculating, she said. Yes. He did not argue with that or soften it. That will not stop being true. She was quiet for a moment. The snow was still coming down, but the wind had changed character since the shot, less aggressive, settling into the steady fall. That usually means the worst of a storm has passed through and left behind something more manageable. You told them about me, she said. I told them enough. How much is enough? Pratt thought about this with apparent seriousness. I told them to wait for you, which was true and useful and didn't require the rest of it. The rest of it. She sat with that phrase. She had been, until age 26, the youngest member of a classified program that she was never permitted to name and which she had been told, upon her departure, did not officially exist. The program was concerned with what its directors called non-instrumental targeting analysis, the question of whether certain individuals could perform, under controlled conditions, ballistic calculations of sufficient accuracy to be operationally useful without the instruments that made such calculations formally possible. The answer, for a very few people, was yes. She had been the clearest yes the program ever produced. She had also been responsible, at 24 years old, for a calculation that was correct. The calculation had been correct. The information she had been given to base it on had been wrong. The target coordinates had been wrong by 600 meters due to a mapping error that was not discovered until 48 hours after the event, and the round that should have neutralized a weapons storage facility had instead impacted a location that was not a weapons storage facility. The people who had given her the wrong coordinates had been very sorry. Their sorrow was genuine, and it changed nothing. This is a truth that most professions insulate themselves from. That in most work, the gap between error and consequence has sufficient friction that course corrections are possible. In certain kinds of work, that gap is measured in seconds and the consequence arrives before the error is identified. She had spent 3 months being told it was not her fault. She had spent the following 8 years building a life that had nothing to do with projectile physics. She had discovered that the precision that worked with ballistics also worked with fabric, that the eye which could read a wind field could also read a misaligned seam, that the hands which could feel the mechanical personality of a rifle could also feel the specific resistance of silk versus wool versus cotton, that the patience which made one useful in a hide position also made one useful to a client who needed a 30-year-old jacket made wearable again. She worked from a small room in the back of a building that was 3 floors of mixed-use urban construction, a pharmacy below, an accountant beside her, a family of 5 above. She had clients who had been coming to her for 6 years. An elderly man who brought her his dead wife's dresses, one at a time, to be adjusted for his daughter who was built differently and who wore them to events the dead woman would have loved. A young professional who had bought one very expensive suit and needed it to last a decade. A teenage girl whose prom dress had been damaged 2 days before the event and who had sat in Elena's small reception chair trying not to cry while Elena worked for 4 hours without stopping. She was very good at restoring what had drifted. She was, if she was honest with herself, better at it than she had been at the other thing, or perhaps she was equally precise and the stakes were simply more proportionate to the scale of the error. A badly adjusted hem does not change the world, except, sometimes, for the person wearing the dress. She had not been wrong. The work had been wrong. These were different things, and she had learned, slowly, to believe in the difference. Tonight, she had been told who the target was. She had asked 3 times, independently, for confirmation. The confirmation had come from sources she could cross-reference. She had done the work. The calculation had been correct. You never told anyone where you went, Pratt said. It was not an accusation. The shop, the alterations. It's good work. She said this simply, without defensiveness. Things break down. Things drift. A good hem on a coat that someone wears every day for 10 years. She stopped. It matters. The small thing done correctly, over time, matters. Pratt nodded. He seemed to understand something she had not finished saying. There were people, after you left, he said, who spent a considerable amount of time arguing about whether what you do can be learned, or whether it's simply something that is. He paused. They never settled it. What do you think? I think some people have a relationship with physics that is difficult to explain and pointless to argue about. He stood up, joints expressing their opinions about the cold. I think the wind will start cooperating in about 3 hours and you should sleep if you can. She watched him walk away. Then she looked at the rifle, which she had set down in the snow beside her, stock and barrel, scope facing the sky. She picked it up and wiped the snow from the glass with her sleeve. Fleming went to the ridgeline and confirmed what the scope had suggested. He did not come back and say what he had found. He just nodded at Harlow from 30 meters away, and Harlow understood. It changed something. Not the storm was indifferent to human outcomes, but something in the disposition of the people caught inside it. There is a quality to sustained threat that accumulates in the body without the body being fully aware of it, a compression in the shoulders and the lungs and the back of the skull, and when the threat is removed there is a counter-movement, a physical unwinding that happens whether you want it to or not. The men unwound by approximately 20%. Not enough to be dangerous. Enough to be functional again in a way that terror had made impossible. We still have no extraction, Harlow said. He gathered them what remained of them in a position that the ridgeline's new silence made tenable. We still have no communication until the storm breaks. We still have compromised position in contested territory. He looked at each of them in turn. What we don't have is an immediate threat to our survival. He looked at Elena, who had not joined the group but was visible at its edge. The storm will break. Air support will come. Our job right now is to maintain position and stay functional. He paused, which means medical checks, rotation of cold watch, and controlled movement to keep core temperature stable. And her? Dylan asked. He was not looking at Elena when he said it. He was looking at the rifle she had set back in its case. Harlow looked at Dylan for a moment. Staff Sergeant Dylan, go check on the other civilians. Dylan went. He walked past Elena on his way, and he stopped. He stopped for approximately 2 seconds, which is not very long and is also, in certain contexts, a significant amount of time. He did not say anything. He continued walking. It was, in the particular vocabulary of men who communicate through absence as much as presence, an acknowledgement. It was not an apology. Men like Dylan are not built for apologies in the direct sense, and Elena would not have wanted one in any case. It was something more fundamental, a revision. The internal ledger that a professional keeps, on which assessments of other professionals are recorded, had made an entry. The entry was not accompanied by ceremony because it did not need to be. She registered it and set it aside and returned her attention to the terrain. She became, in the next 3 hours, something the team had not anticipated and did not entirely know how to classify. She was not a soldier. She carried no authority. She did not offer opinions on tactical decisions and was not asked for them. But she had an awareness of the terrain that was specific and useful, and she shared it with a brevity that the team learned to trust. The North Corridor is the extraction route, she said once, looking at a map with Harlow. But the Eastern Gully will have better thermal signature at dawn, less wind load, more radiation from the rock. Helicopter approach from the south will see it more easily against the background. Harlow had been thinking about this. He had been thinking about it from a tactical direction. She had just given him the same conclusion from a meteorological one, which meant it was probably right. He adjusted the extraction beacon accordingly. Fleming, at some point during the second hour, sat down next to her unbidden. He had been running the shot through his head. She could tell by the quality of his stillness, which was the stillness of a mind actively working rather than a mind at rest. He sat with his knees up and his gloved hands resting on them, looking at the valley, and the valley did not appear to be what he was actually looking at. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The elevation adjustment you made before the shot. The additional eighth of a turn. That was for the temperature change. Over 4 kilometers, accounting for the thermal gradient between the valley floor and the upper ridgeline. With the cold air sink effect on the western face, the effective air density shift would have been," he did his math silently, "somewhere around 0.8% lower density at the target end compared to the origin. 0.79, she said. At my best estimate of the temperature." He was quiet again. Then, "I've been doing this for 6 years. I would have been off by half a second of elevation. You would have corrected on the second round," she said. "That's the right instinct. There wouldn't have been time for a second round." She did not argue with that. Fleming looked at the stars that were becoming. As the storm thinned, very dimly visible, the first suggestion of sky above the gray that had been everything. "Where did you learn it?" he said. "Slowly," she said. He seemed to accept that. The storm broke at 0617. It did not announce itself. The wind simply made a decision somewhere up in the system and stopped arguing with the terrain, and the snow thinned from heavy to light to scattered, and between the scattered flakes the sky appeared first gray, then a dark blue that brightened by degrees as the sun, still below the eastern ridgeline, began to make its presence known in the atmosphere. The mountains appeared in pieces. A ridge here, a face there, the valley floor last, white and still and immense, the kind of scale that makes the human body feel briefly like a mistake. Corporal Wren, on radio watch, picked up the extraction signal at 0641. He was so young that his relief expressed itself as simple glee, which he then tried to compress into something more soldier-like, which did not entirely succeed. 40 minutes, Harlow said. He looked at his remaining team, 8 men from the 10 who had entered the operation, if you counted himself. He was counting himself. He looked at the civilians, who had spent the night moving between shock and exhaustion and back again. They were upright. They were functional. He looked at Elena Voss. She was standing at the edge of the position, looking at the valley with the same quality of attention she had been giving it all night. Though the nature of that attention had changed, the operational focus was gone, replaced by something less purposeful and more fundamental. The way a person looks at a landscape they may not see again. He walked over and stood beside her. "The helicopter will be here in 38 minutes, he said. "Good." The valley was extraordinary in the early light. The snow was blue in the shadows and almost gold where the first light caught it, and the ridgelines above were sharp in the cold, clean air in a way that mountains only are after a storm has scrubbed the atmosphere of everything impure. "I need to ask you something," Harlow said. "All right." He did not ask it immediately. He looked at the ridgeline across the valley, the northeast face, where something had ended in the darkness several hours ago. The program, whatever it was. She waited. "You left it because of the mapping error." She was quiet for a moment, because of what came after the mapping error. The conversation where everyone agreed it was not my fault, and then the silence where everyone stopped giving me work that mattered. She paused. That was its own answer. He thought about that. "And the alterations shop," he said. "You actually do that?" "I do. It's not cover, no." She turned to look at him, and there was something almost amused in her expression, though it was the very quiet kind of amusement. "A badly tailored coat is a badly tailored coat. It's an honest problem, and you fix it." "I adjust it," she said. "There's a difference. A tailor builds from scratch. I take what's there and I correct where it's drifted." He looked at her. "You're not a seamstress," he said. It was not an accusation. It was not even quite a statement. It was the thing he'd been holding all night, finally set down. She looked back at the valley. "I know how to sew," she said. "And I know how to correct things that have drifted from where they should be." The helicopter appeared over the southern ridge at 0718, right on the mark she had predicted from the meteorological conditions and the approach geometry. It came in low over the valley floor, nose down against a light headwind, and it was the most functional and beautiful thing any of them had seen in 12 hours. Fleming, standing near Harlow, watched Elena walk toward the landing zone with the other civilians. She carried her bag over one shoulder. The gray coat was dirty at the cuffs and hem from the night's work. She had her hands in her pockets. "She left the rifle," Fleming said. "I know." Cleaned, wiped, scope caps on, bolt worked and reset. "I know." Fleming was quiet for a moment. "She would have been something," he said. It was not the right phrase, exactly, and he seemed to know it. "I mean, she is something. She just did the work," Harlow said. "And put it down." Fleming watched her reach the helicopter and stop to let the other civilians board first. She did not look back. "Do you know who she was?" Fleming asked. "Before, I know enough." Harlow started walking toward the landing zone. "And not quite enough, which is probably the right amount." He reached the helicopter last, as a commander does. Elena was already aboard, in the far corner of the bench seating, looking out the small window at the valley that was tilting away as the aircraft lifted and turned south. He took the seat across from her. She did not look away from the window. The valley was receding in the way that mountain valleys recede from helicopters, slowly at first. The individual features still visible and distinguishable, the rock and snow and tree lines still specific, and then all at once the specificity collapses into generality and it becomes simply white terrain below and you are simply in the sky above, and the connection between the two dissolves. She watched it for as long as it was specific. Then she watched it until it was not. He looked at the valley too, at the northeast ridgeline, the white slopes below it, the impossible distance between here and there. "Thank you," he said. She nodded once, slightly, without looking at him. The helicopter flew south. The mountains fell away. The valley became a white shape, and then a white memory, and then the country below the mountains took over. Roads and towns, and the visible evidence of ordinary life going about its business in the early morning. She adjusted something in her coat, a button at the collar that had come slightly loose in the night. She worked it back into proper position with 2 efficient movements, tested it, and left it. Harlow watched this. She looked up and found him watching, and she said nothing. And he said nothing, and between them was the knowledge of what had happened in the night and the equal and mutual understanding that some things require no naming to be fully known. The helicopter carried them south into the morning. Fleming was in the forward section, not looking at anyone. He was doing math in his head. Harlow could tell by the slight set of his jaw, the unfocused quality of his eyes. He was reconstructing the shot from available information, the way a musician might reconstruct a performance they had not played from a score they had not seen, building it from the outside in, from the outcome back to the physics, trying to close the gap between what he knew how to do and what he had watched done. He would be, Harlow suspected, a better shooter for it, not because he would learn to replicate the exact method. Some of what she had done lived in a category of perception that cannot be transferred, only observed, but because the observation itself would expand his model of what was possible, and a shooter's model of what is possible is the ceiling on what they will attempt. The mountains behind them were extraordinary in the new light, white and cold and perfect, holding their silence the way mountains always hold it, completely, without effort, as if silence were simply the natural condition of very large things that have been in place for a very long time. They had been. They would be. The snow that fell through the night continued falling through the morning, covering what the morning found, the way snow always does, gently, and without preference, and equally over everything.